The punishment wasn't designed to kill quickly. That would have been merciful, and mercy had no place in what was about to happen. The year was 1757, and Paris had gathered to watch a man named Robert-François Damiens die for the unthinkable crime of attempting to assassinate King Louis XIV. What followed wasn't an execution. It was a performance, a demonstration of what happened when you touch the sacred body of a king. They started with his chest. Red-hot pincers, heated in braziers until they glowed like small suns, were used to tear away chunks of his flesh. The executioners worked methodically, almost artistically, removing piece after piece, while Damien screamed. But the screaming was expected, encouraged even. The crowd needed to hear it. They needed to understand that royal power extended beyond the courtroom, beyond the scaffold, into the very meat and bone of anyone who dared challenge it. Then came the sulphur, molten lead, boiling oil, each poured into the wounds the pincers had created. The smell must have been unbearable. Burning flesh mixed with sulphur creates a stench that observers described as clinging to their clothes for days afterward. Some in the crowd vomited, others fainted, but most stayed. They had come to witness justice, or what passed for justice when a king's pride had been wounded. If you've ever wondered what separates a punishment from a message, what transforms state violence from necessity into spectacle, then stay with this. Because what happened to Damiens wasn't unusual. It was standard practice across Europe for centuries. Kings didn't just punish crimes, they punished them in ways that demonstrated the gulf between royal power and everyone else. And if this grips you the way it should, if you want to understand the machinery of cruelty that kings built into their legal systems, then subscribe. Because there are more stories like this, hundreds of them, and we're going to tell everyone. Now back to Damiens. After the burning came the horses, 4 of them, each attached to one of his limbs. The theory was simple. Pull hard enough in 4 different directions, and the body would separate at the joints. It was called being drawn and quartered, and it had been the punishment for treason in France for centuries. But Damiens' body wouldn't cooperate. His joints held. The horses pulled for over an hour while he remained conscious, his body stretched but not broken, his screams never quite stopping. Finally, the executioners intervened. They used knives to cut through the tendons and ligaments the horses couldn't tear. Only then did his body come apart. His limbs were displayed in different parts of Paris as a warning. His torso was burned to ash. Nothing remained to bury. Nothing remained to mourn. He had been erased not just from life, but from death itself, denied even the dignity of a corpse. The crowd that watched this wasn't composed of bloodthirsty peasants, though that's how we like to imagine. Historical audiences for atrocity. These were lawyers, merchants, aristocrats, priests. Educated people who understood that what they were watching was legal, sanctioned, necessary. The king had been attacked. The body politic had been violated. And the only response that made sense in their worldview was to violate Damiens' body in return, publicly, extensively, until the message was unmistakable. But here's what the history books usually skip over. The attack that triggered all this wasn't even close to successful. Damiens had approached Louis XV with a small penknife and managed to inflict a wound so minor that the king didn't initially realise he'd been stabbed. It was barely more than a scratch. Louis was back to his normal routine within days. The assassination attempt was pathetic by any measure. Yet the response was this: hours of torture, dismemberment, public spectacle. Why? Because the severity of the punishment had nothing to do with the severity of the crime. It had everything to do with who had been threatened. Touch a commoner with a knife, even kill him, and you might face hanging. A relatively quick death. But touch a king, even unsuccessfully, even incompetently, and the full machinery of royal terror would be brought to bear. This wasn't about justice. It was about maintaining the fiction that kings were fundamentally different from other humans. Their bodies were sacred. Their persons were inviolable. An attack on them wasn't just a crime against an individual, but a crime against the cosmic order itself. And so the punishment had to be cosmic in its cruelty, demonstrating that the natural hierarchy of the universe had been restored through the ritualistic destruction of the transgressor's body. Michel Foucault, the French philosopher who studied these public executions extensively, described them as performances of power. The king's authority, which in daily life might seem abstract or distant, became concrete and visible through the tortured body of the condemned. Every scream, every wound, every severed limb was a statement. This is what happens when you forget your place. This is what royal power looks like when it stops being metaphorical and becomes physical. And the thing is, it worked. For centuries, it worked. People internalized these spectacles. They told their children about them. They used them as cautionary tales. The executions created a kind of cultural memory that extended far beyond the individuals who actually witnessed them. You didn't need to see a man torn apart by horses to know it could happen to you. The story itself was enough to enforce compliance, but Damien's execution, spectacular as it was, represented something of an endpoint rather than a continuation. By 1757, Enlightenment ideas about rational punishment and proportionate justice were already circulating among European intellectuals. Thinkers like Cesare Beccaria were arguing that cruel punishments didn't deter crime more effectively than moderate ones, that torture was barbaric and counterproductive, that the purpose of criminal justice should be reformation and deterrence, not vengeance and spectacle. Within decades, France would abolish torture officially. The guillotine, introduced during the Revolution, was presented as a humane alternative to the old methods. Quick, painless, democratic even, since it was used on aristocrats and commoners alike. The age of spectacular royal punishment was ending, at least in Western Europe. But its legacy remained, encoded in legal systems and cultural memory. What's easy to forget is that these punishments didn't emerge from sadism or madness. They emerged from a specific political logic. Medieval and early modern kings didn't have large bureaucracies or standing armies sufficient to enforce their will everywhere at once. Their power was, in many ways, more theoretical than actual. They ruled vast territories with minimal infrastructure. How do you control a population when you can't constantly surveil them, when you can't station soldiers in every village, when communication itself takes weeks? You make examples. You select certain crimes, certain criminals, and you punish them so severely, so publicly, so memorably, that everyone else gets the message without needing to be personally threatened. One man tortured in Paris sends ripples of fear across all of France. One body displayed in pieces reminds thousands of others what defiance costs. It's efficient, in a horrifying way. And it wasn't just about political crimes like Damien's attempted regicide. Sexual crimes, religious crimes, crimes against property, all could trigger these spectacular punishments if the king decided to make an example. The discretion was almost unlimited. A king could transform any violation into an opportunity for public demonstration of his power. The law was less a consistent code than a collection of possibilities that could be deployed strategically depending on political needs. This is why studying these punishments matters. Not because they're shocking, though they are. Not because they're historically curious, though they are. But because they reveal the foundations on which modern state power was built. Every legal system today, no matter how rational or humane it claims to be, descends from these systems of ritualized violence. We've changed the methods, softened the rhetoric, hidden the brutality behind prison walls where it's less visible. But the basic bargain remains the same. The state claims a monopoly on violence, and we consent to that monopoly in exchange for protection and order. What happened to Damien's was extreme, even for its time. But it wasn't aberrant. It was the logical extension of principles that kings across Europe embraced for centuries. And those principles didn't die with the abolition of torture. They evolved, they adapted. They found new forms that were more palatable to modern sensibilities, but no less effective at maintaining hierarchies of power. But if you think Damien's had it bad, consider what happened to people whose crimes weren't political, but sexual. Because this is where kings really demonstrated their cruelty. Sexual transgression threatened not just the social order, but the cosmic one. It undermined marriages, corrupted bloodlines, violated religious law. And most importantly, it challenged the king's authority over the most intimate aspects of his subjects' lives. And so sexual punishments became some of the most inventive, most degrading, most deliberately humiliating forms of torture that royal power could devise. Take adultery. In medieval and early modern Europe, this wasn't just a private matter between spouses. It was a crime against God, against nature, against the stability of property inheritance, against everything that held society together. And if you were caught, especially if you were a woman, the punishment would be designed not just to hurt you, but to destroy you socially, to make you an object lesson that every other woman would remember when temptation arose. In some German territories, adulterous women were stripped naked and forced to run through the streets, while townspeople threw rocks and refuse at them. But that was just the beginning, the warm-up to the real punishment. They would be taken to the town square, where a specially designed cage waited. Not large enough to stand in, not large enough to lie down in, just large enough to crouch in agonizing positions, your body on display, your shame made public. These cages were sometimes hung from poles or buildings, suspending the woman above the crowd like a grotesque decoration. Sometimes they were placed at ground level, where children could poke at the condemned with sticks, where men could shout obscenities, where the entire community could participate in the degradation. The woman would remain there for days, sometimes weeks, without shelter from sun or rain, without privacy to relieve herself, without dignity of any kind. The cruelty was the point. The king, through his magistrates and judges, was demonstrating that sexual order was as important as political order. Your body wasn't your own. Your desires weren't your own. Everything you did, even in the privacy of your bedroom, was subject to royal authority. And if you forgot that, the cage reminded you. It reminded everyone. But at least those women were alive when they came down from the cages. Others weren't so fortunate. In France and parts of Italy, adultery could warrant execution, but not the relatively quick death of hanging or beheading. No. Adulterous women were sometimes buried alive up to their necks, their heads left protruding from the ground, unable to move, unable to escape, slowly dying of thirst and exposure, while passers-by hurled insults and occasionally stones. The symbolism was unmistakable. you had dug your own grave through sin. Now you would literally be placed in it while still breathing, a preview of the eternal damnation that awaited your soul. The punishment straddled the line between secular justice and religious judgment, reminding everyone that the king ruled with divine sanction and that sexual sin was both a legal crime and a spiritual corruption. Men who committed adultery faced punishment too, though it was rarely as severe or as sexualized. The double standard was explicit and unapologetic. Women's sexuality threatened the legitimacy of heirs, the purity of bloodlines, the foundation of patriarchal property transfer. Men's sexuality, while theoretically subject to the same moral laws, didn't carry the same social risks, so male adulterers might be fined, publicly shamed, occasionally whipped. But they were rarely caged, rarely buried, rarely subjected to the extended theatrical degradation that women endured. Then there were the punishments for rape, which reveal even more about how kings understood sexual crime. Because in most European legal systems before the modern era, rape wasn't primarily conceptualized as a crime against the woman. It was a crime against her father or her husband, a theft of property, a violation of another man's rights. The punishment, therefore, wasn't designed to vindicate the victim, but to compensate the man who owned her sexuality. If the rapist was of lower social status than the victim's family, he might be castrated. But this wasn't about justice for the woman. It was about eliminating the threat he posed to the property interests of more important men. The castration would be public, performed in the town square, with the same crowd-pleasing brutality that characterized all royal punishments. The rapist's genitals would be removed, often without any effort to staunch the bleeding, and he would be left to either survive or die from the wound. If he was of equal or higher status, particularly if he was nobility, the punishment might be merely financial. A payment to the victim's father or husband, an acknowledgement of the property damage, perhaps a forced marriage to the victim, which is among the most grotesque solutions to sexual violence imaginable, but was considered reasonable in systems where women's sexual autonomy simply didn't exist as a legal concept. What's striking about all of these sexual punishments is how much they focused on public display and communal participation. Private punishment, behind closed doors, wouldn't serve the purpose. The point was to create a spectacle that reinforced sexual norms, that reminded everyone of the consequences of transgression, that allowed the community to collectively punish and thereby collectively reaffirm their shared values. This is why sexual punishments were often scheduled for market days or festivals, when the maximum number of people would be present to witness them. The execution or humiliation became part of the day's entertainment, mixed in with buying goods and greeting neighbours. The normalisation of this violence, its integration into ordinary social life, is perhaps more disturbing than the violence itself. And kings innovated constantly, finding new ways to punish sexual crimes that would capture public attention and imagination. In some regions, prostitutes who operated without royal license, because yes, prostitution was often taxed and regulated by the crown, would have their noses slit, a permanent mark of their transgression, visible to everyone they encountered for the rest of their lives. They couldn't hide what they'd done. Their faces became billboards advertising the wages of sin. In other areas, men convicted of sodomy face punishments so severe that even describing them risks dulling their impact through familiarity with historical horror. They would be burned alive, but slowly, the fire built carefully to prolong suffering. Or they would be impaled, a punishment borrowed from the Ottoman Empire, and enthusiastically adopted by some European rulers, where a sharpened stake would be inserted through the rectum and the victim hoisted upright, gravity slowly drawing them down onto the stake over hours or days. The sexual nature of the crime was punished through the sexual nature of the execution. The body part that sinned became the instrument of death. This logic, twisted as it is, made perfect sense in a worldview where physical punishment was meant to mirror spiritual corruption. Your body had betrayed God and King through illicit desire, so your body would be destroyed in a way that everyone could recognize as specifically tailored to your sin. But perhaps nothing demonstrates the intersection of sexual control and royal power more clearly than the punishment of women accused of infanticide. This crime was almost always linked to illegitimate pregnancy, to women who had conceived outside marriage, and then, facing social and economic ruin, killed their newborns. The punishment varied by region but was universally horrific. Some were sewn into sacks with live animals, snakes or cats or dogs, and thrown into rivers. The animals would panic and claw at anything nearby, including the woman, as they all drowned together. The symbolism was rich. She had violated natural law by killing her offspring, so she would die in a way that confused and violated natural categories, human and animal mixed together in a sack, drowning in water that represented both baptism and death. Others were impaled on stakes and displayed at crossroads, their bodies left to rot as warnings. Crossroads were significant, liminal spaces where the earthly and spiritual worlds intersected, where witches were said to gather, where the unquiet dead wandered. Placing the infanticide's body there suggested she had crossed a boundary, not just of law but of humanity itself. What's crucial to understand is that these punishments existed in legal codes, were carried out by official executioners, were witnessed by magistrates and recorded by scribes. This wasn't mob justice or vigilante violence, this was the state, operating through royal authority, systematically torturing and killing people for sexual transgressions. The bureaucracy of cruelty is what makes it so disturbing. Someone had to design these punishments, codify them in law, train executioners in their implementation, build the specialized equipment required. There were craftsmen whose entire profession was building execution devices, cages for adulterers, stakes for sodomites, wheels for breaking bodies. These items appear in municipal budgets, in records of payments to blacksmiths and carpenters. The banality of administrative evil, centuries before Hannah Arendt coined the phrase to describe Nazi bureaucrats. The same principle applied. Ordinary people doing their jobs, filing their paperwork, collecting their wages, all in service of industrialized cruelty. And the kings who ordered these punishments, who enshrined them in law, who demanded their public performance, they weren't monsters in the fairy tale sense. They were intelligent, often educated, sometimes genuinely pious men who believed absolutely in their right and duty to control their subjects' bodies and sexualities. They saw themselves as maintaining order, enforcing God's will, protecting society from corruption. This is what makes historical atrocity so difficult to process. It's not committed by people who think they're doing evil. It's committed by people who are certain they're doing good, who have entire philosophical and theological systems justifying their actions, who can cite scripture and legal precedent and political necessity for every torture they inflict. The sexual punishments kings devised weren't aberrations. They were features of a system that saw human bodies as resources to be controlled, disciplined, and displayed in service of maintaining hierarchies of power. And while we've abolished the specific practices, burned the cages, melted down the stakes, the underlying logic hasn't entirely disappeared. It's evolved, become more subtle, hidden itself behind therapeutic and administrative language. But the desire to control sexuality, to punish deviation, to make examples of those who violate sexual norms, that persists in ways we're often reluctant to examine. But there's one king whose name has become synonymous with sexual cruelty, whose punishments were so excessive that even his contemporaries, people who lived in an age of routine torture, were shocked. His name was Vlad the of Wallachia, though history knows him better as Vlad the Impaler, and while popular culture has turned him into a vampire, the real man was far more terrifying than any fictional monster. Vlad ruled a small principality in what is now Romania during the mid-15th century, caught between the expanding Ottoman Empire and the Kingdom of Hungary, navigating impossible political terrain through a combination of strategic brilliance and spectacular violence. And when it came to punishments, particularly for sexual crimes, he elevated cruelty to an art form that still disturbs us 5 centuries later. The impalement stake was his signature, but not every impalement was the same. Vlad had refined the technique into something almost scientific. For ordinary criminals, the stake might be sharpened to a point, killing relatively quickly as it pierced vital organs. But for those who had committed sexual transgressions, those who had violated his strict moral code, the stake was deliberately blunted, rounded at the tip, sometimes even oiled to ease its passage. Why? Because a blunt stake wouldn't pierce organs, it would push them aside. It would slide between tissue planes, causing maximum pain while avoiding immediate death. A skilled executioner could insert a blunt stake through the rectum or vagina and thread it through the body cavity, emerging from the shoulder or neck, without hitting anything immediately fatal. The victim could survive for days impaled like this, fully conscious, displayed vertically for everyone to see. Women accused of adultery received this punishment frequently under Vlad's rule, but he added refinements that the historical sources describe with horrified fascination. Sometimes he would have the woman's breasts cut off before impalement and nailed to poles beside her. Sometimes he would have her sexual organs mutilated, the parts that had sinned destroyed before the stake was inserted. The symbolism was always clear. You use these body parts for illicit pleasure. Now they become instruments of your agony. One account, recorded by a German pamphleteer who visited Wallachia shortly after Vlad's death, describes a scene outside the capital of Târgoviște. Hundreds of stakes formed a forest of the impaled, arranged in geometric patterns, creating a grotesque landscape of dying and dead bodies. Among them were women accused of sexual crimes, their bodies positioned so that their violations were visible to anyone approaching the city. This wasn't hidden in a dungeon. This was the first thing visitors saw. This was Vlad's version of urban planning. The propaganda purpose was explicit. He was demonstrating total control over his territory, down to the most intimate behaviours of his subjects. Fornication. Adultery, even immodest dress, could trigger these punishments. Vlad positioned himself as the enforcer of sexual morality, using the most extreme violence to create a population too terrified to transgress even in private. And according to the sources, it worked. Crime rates in Wallachia during his reign were remarkably low. Fear is an effective deterrent when backed by consistent, overwhelming brutality. But Vlad didn't reserve these punishments solely for his own people. When Ottoman ambassadors visited and refused to remove their turbans in his presence, citing religious custom, he had the turbans nailed to their heads. When merchants from Transylvania tried to cheat him in trade negotiations, he had them impaled with their coins scattered around the stakes. and when the Ottoman Sultan sent a force to capture him, Vlad retreated but left behind a forest of 20,000 impaled Ottoman prisoners, arranged along the route of march, creating a corridor of death that reportedly caused the Sultan to turn back in disgust. The sexual component appeared here too. Among the impaled were Ottoman soldiers who had raped local women during the invasion. Vlad had them castrated before impalement, their severed genitals stuffed in their mouths, creating a tableau that mixed punishment with propaganda. He was defending Christian women against Muslim violation, at least in his own narrative, positioning himself as a protector while simultaneously demonstrating that he could be more ruthlessly violent than any invader. Modern historians debate how much of the Vlad legend is true versus propaganda created by his enemies. The German pamphlets that spread his reputation across Europe were printed by merchants and nobles he'd antagonized, people with every reason to exaggerate his cruelty. The Romanian sources, meanwhile, often portray him as a harsh but necessary ruler who protected his people from Ottoman conquest and internal corruption. The truth is probably somewhere between these extremes. Vlad certainly used impalement as a punishment and a political tool. The archaeological evidence and contemporary Ottoman accounts confirm this, but the scale and systematization described in the German pamphlets may have been exaggerated. Hundreds of impaled victims rather than thousands. Brutal public executions rather than forests of stakes. Still horrific, but perhaps not quite the industrial-scale operation later sources suggested. What's not in dispute is that Vlad understood the propaganda value of extreme punishment. He knew that stories of his cruelty would spread faster and farther than any army he could field. Merchants would carry the tales to foreign courts. Soldiers would whisper them around campfires. His reputation became a weapon as effective as any stake, discouraging rebellion, deterring invasion, maintaining order through the threat of unthinkable consequences. And the sexual punishment served a specific function within this broader strategy. Controlling sexuality meant controlling family formation, inheritance, loyalty, the basic building blocks of feudal society. A population that feared to transgress sexually was a population that wouldn't form unauthorized alliances, wouldn't create bastard children who might challenge legitimate heirs, wouldn't undermine the careful network of marriages and bloodlines that held political power together. Vlad's contemporary princes across Europe used similar logic, though few matched his theatrical brutality. In England, Henry VIII would soon demonstrate that kings could destroy people for sexual crimes, even at the highest levels of society. Anne Boleyn, convicted on almost certainly fabricated charges of adultery and incest, was beheaded on Tower Green, her alleged lovers tortured and executed first so she could know exactly what was coming. The sexual charges against Anne were political weapons, but they worked because everyone understood that a queen's sexuality was even more tightly controlled than a commoner's. She had to produce legitimate heirs. Her body was a vessel for the continuation of the dynasty. Any suggestion that she had violated that sacred trust, even if completely invented, was enough to justify her destruction, and Henry made sure the execution was public and memorable. Anne was forced to watch her brother and the other accused men die before her own execution. She was denied the privacy of dying in the Tower and instead was brought to a specially constructed scaffold where a crowd could witness her final moments. The French swordsman brought in to perform the execution was presented as a mercy, quicker and cleaner than the axe. But the real message was about royal power, extending even into the choice of how you would die. In Spain, Ferdinand and Isabella, The same monarchs who funded Columbus and expelled the Jews established the Spanish Inquisition, partly to police sexual morality among converted Jews and Muslims. Those accused of Judaizing or secretly maintaining Islamic practices often faced charges that included sexual deviancy, the two forms of transgression deliberately conflated. The Inquisition had developed torture into a sophisticated technology, with detailed manuals describing exactly how much pain to inflict to extract confessions without causing death. Sexual torture was explicitly used against women accused of heresy or witchcraft. The breast ripper, a device designed to tear women's breasts from their bodies, was employed with the justification that breasts used to nurse heretical children or seduce good Christian men deserved to be destroyed. The device appears in Inquisition inventories, sometimes in multiple sizes for different body types, a grotesque attention to detail that reveals how systematized this cruelty had become. The strappado, another favored Inquisition technique, involved tying the victim's hands behind their back and hoisting them by the wrists, dislocating shoulders and causing excruciating pain. For women accused of sexual sins, weights were sometimes attached to the ankles or objects inserted into the vagina before the hoisting, sexualizing the torture in ways designed to humiliate as much as hurt. And all of this was recorded. Scribes attended torture sessions, documenting the questions asked, the confessions extracted, the number of turns of the rack or drops from the strappado. These weren't secret abuses hidden from oversight. They were official procedures, approved by church authorities, carried out according to precise regulations. The bureaucracy of sexual torture was even more developed than the bureaucracy of political torture, because sexual crimes were seen as requiring more careful investigation, more thorough extraction of detail. The witch hunts that swept across Europe from the 15th through 17th centuries represented perhaps the peak of sexualized royal punishment, though the authority here was often shared between church and state. Women accused of witchcraft, which in practice meant women who didn't fit social norms, faced interrogations explicitly focused on sexual activity. Had they copulated with demons? Had they attended Sabbaths where orgies occurred? Had they used their sexuality to corrupt good men? The torture used to extract these confessions was often sexual in nature. Victims were stripped naked for examination, searching for the devil's mark, which could be any mole, birthmark or scar. Needles were inserted into these marks to see if they bled or caused pain. The searches were often male, and the examinations were invasive, sometimes indistinguishable from sexual assault. But it was all legal, all sanctioned, all recorded in official documents as necessary investigation. When confessions had been extracted through torture, and they almost always were since human beings will eventually say anything to make pain stop, the executions were public spectacles designed to reinforce sexual norms. Witches were burned alive, often after being strangled if they showed proper contrition, but sometimes not. The burning was specifically chosen for sexual crimes and heresy because fire purified, destroying the corrupted body entirely, leaving nothing behind that could contaminate the earth. And the crowds that gathered for these burnings were enormous. Thousands of people would travel to witness a particularly notorious witch being executed. Vendors sold food and drink. Musicians played. Children ran between the adults' legs, playing games while a woman screamed as flames consumed her. The normalization of this violence, its transformation into community entertainment, reveals how deeply these punishments were embedded in the social fabric. Kings presided over this system, sanctioned it, profited from it, since property of the convicted was often seized by the crown. and used it to maintain control over populations that vastly outnumbered their armed forces. Sexual punishment was social, control made visceral, a constant reminder that no aspect of life was beyond royal authority, that even your body in its most private moments belonged ultimately to the king. But perhaps the most revealing aspect of these royal sexual punishments is what happened when they were applied to the powerful. Because occasionally, the machinery of sexual torture that kings had built to control commoners turned on the aristocracy itself, and when it did, the hypocrisy became impossible to ignore. The rules that applied to peasants suddenly became inconvenient when they threatened noble bloodlines. And yet, sometimes kings enforced them anyway, demonstrating that even birth and wealth couldn't always protect you from the sexual control apparatus of the state. Take the case of Diane de Poitiers and her relationship with King Henri II of France in the 16th century. Diane was nearly 20 years older than Henri, had been his father's mistress before becoming his, and wielded enormous political power through her sexual relationship with the king. By all the moral standards that governed common women, she should have been condemned. She was an adulteress, the king was married, she was profiting materially from illicit sex, accumulating wealth and estates through royal favour earned in the bedchamber. But she was never punished, never caged, never publicly shamed, never subjected to any of the degrading spectacles that common adulteresses endured. Why? Because she was noble, because she was useful to the king, and because the rules about sexual morality were never actually about morality. They were about control, and people in power didn't need to be controlled the same way people without power did. This double standard was so blatant that contemporary observers commented on it constantly. The same courts that sentenced servant women to whipping and caging for fornication looked the other way when noble women took lovers, as long as they were discreet about it. The same laws that mandated castration for low-status rapists allowed noble rapists to settle matters with financial compensation or forced marriage. Justice wasn't blind. It was acutely aware of social hierarchy and adjusted accordingly. But sometimes kings made examples of nobles too, usually when political advantage aligned with moral enforcement. Catherine Howard, Henry V's fifth wife, was barely 20 when she was executed for adultery. Like Anne Boleyn before her, the charges may have been exaggerated or even fabricated, but that didn't matter. Henry needed to be rid of her, and sexual transgression was the most effective charge because it carried moral weight that political disagreement didn't. Catherine's execution was designed to be more humiliating than Anne's had been. Where Anne was allowed to maintain some dignity in her final speech, Catherine was reportedly so terrified that she could barely speak. Where Anne was executed privately on Tower Green, Catherine's execution was more public. The block position so that more witnesses could see. The message had evolved. Even queens weren't safe from sexual punishment if the king decided to deploy it. And it wasn't just queens. Mary, Queen of Scots, executed by Elizabeth, faced charges that included sexual impropriety and murder of her husband, the sexual component designed to delegitimize her claim to the English throne. Elizabeth herself faced constant sexual innuendo and accusation from her enemies, who couldn't quite punish her directly, but could attack her reputation, questioning her virginity, spreading rumours of secret pregnancies and hidden lovers. The sexual vulnerability of powerful women reveals how these punishment systems worked. Sexual accusation was a tool that could be deployed against anyone, regardless of actual behaviour. It was particularly effective against women because their sexuality was always already suspect, always understood as potentially dangerous and requiring constant surveillance. But it could be used against men too. especially when their sexuality deviated from acceptable norms. Edward II of England was deposed and murdered in 1327, officially for political failures, but with his relationship with Piers Gaveston used as evidence of his unfitness to rule. The accusations of sodomy, whether true or fabricated, delegitimized him in ways that mere political incompetence couldn't. And his death, according to some sources, though disputed by modern historians, involved a red-hot poker inserted into his rectum, a sexualized murder that punished him through the body part that had allegedly sinned. Whether this actually happened or was propaganda invented by his enemies doesn't ultimately matter for understanding how sexual punishment worked. The story circulated. People believed it. It became part of the cultural understanding of what happened when even kings violated sexual norms. The punishment fit the crime in the symbolic economy of medieval justice. You sinned through sodomy. You died through anal penetration. The logic was inescapable within that worldview. But the most systematic use of sexual punishment against the powerful came during the French Revolution, when the tables turned and the crowd that had once gathered to watch royal executions now demanded royal blood. Marie Antoinette's trial included charges of sexual perversion, specifically that she had committed incest with her young son. The charges were almost certainly false, invented by revolutionaries who needed to transform her from sympathetic victim into monster deserving of death. The sexual component was crucial. It wasn't enough to execute her for being queen, for representing the old regime, for political crimes. She had to be morally destroyed first, her sexuality weaponized against her, her body made disgusting in the public imagination, so that her death would feel like purification rather than murder. And it worked. The crowds that watched her ride to the guillotine saw not a woman but a sexual deviant, a corrupting force that needed to be eliminated. Even in death, she wasn't spared sexualized humiliation. Accounts describe the executioner holding up her severed head, and some sources claim that the crowd shouted not just political slogans, but sexual insults, reducing her even in that final moment to her gender and alleged sexual transgressions. The revolution had supposedly abolished the old ways, had introduced rational justice and equality before the law. But when it came to executing a powerful woman, they reached for the same tools of sexual degradation that kings had used for centuries. This brings us to the uncomfortable truth about these punishments. They didn't disappear when monarchy ended. They evolved. The French Revolution replaced public torture with the guillotine, which was more egalitarian in that it killed aristocrats and commoners with equal efficiency, but it retained the public spectacle, the crowd participation, the use of execution as political theatre. And it absolutely retained the sexualization of punishment for women. In the decades that followed across Europe, as liberal reforms gradually eliminated the most spectacular forms of torture, sexual punishment didn't vanish. It went private. Women convicted of prostitution or adultery were no longer caged in town squares, but they were sent to reformatories where the punishment continued behind closed doors. The Magdalen laundries in Ireland, which operated well into the 20th century, imprisoned women for sexual transgressions, forcing them into unpaid labour under conditions that were often brutal. The last Magdalen laundry didn't close until 1996. Let that sink in. Women were still being imprisoned for sexual behaviour, still being subjected to forced labour and psychological abuse as punishment for pregnancy, outside marriage or suspected promiscuity, in living memory. The system that medieval kings built, the apparatus of sexual control enforced through punishment, it didn't die,
It adapted. It found new forms that were less visible, less obviously violent, but no less effective at controlling women's sexuality. And it's not just historical. Look at how sexual crimes are punished differently, even now depending on the status of the perpetrator. Wealthy men convicted of rape receive sentences that poor men never would. Brock Turner serves 3 months for sexual assault because the judge worries about the impact on his future. Meanwhile, poor men, especially poor men of colour, receive decades for similar or lesser crimes. The double standard that let noble rapists pay fines while commoner rapists were castrated. That's still with us, just dressed in different language.
The surveillance of women's sexuality continues too, though now it's medicalised and bureaucratised rather than enforced through cages and stakes. Women seeking abortions in many jurisdictions face mandatory waiting periods, forced ultrasounds, requirements to view images, or hear descriptions designed to shame them. These aren't medieval tortures, but they're descendants of the same impulse to control women's bodies, to punish sexual autonomy, to make examples of those who transgress. The kings who invented these sexual punishments, who refined them over centuries, who encoded them in law and built the infrastructure to carry them out, they're gone. The specific tools they used, the cages and stakes and wheels, those are in museums now, artifacts of a more barbaric age. But the underlying logic persists, the belief that the state has the right to control sexuality, the conviction that sexual transgression deserves unique punishment, the use of sexual humiliation as a tool of social control. What we've done is make it less visible. We've moved punishment behind prison walls where cameras aren't allowed. We've replaced public torture with solitary confinement, which causes psychological damage that's harder to see but no less real. We've substituted medicalised violence for physical violence in some cases, calling it treatment or reform rather than punishment. But the core remains. The state still claims authority over your body, over your sexuality, over your most intimate choices. And when people transgress, when they violate sexual norms or laws, the punishment is still designed to send a message to everyone else. We still make examples. We still use individual cases to enforce broader social control. Jeffrey Epstein's victims waited years for justice while he was protected by wealth and connections. But when the political wind shifted, he became the example, the demonstration that even the powerful can fall if they transgress too publicly. And then he died in custody, under suspicious circumstances, denied even the public trial that might have exposed his accomplices. Because sometimes a message is more important than the truth. The history of sexual punishment reveals something we'd prefer not to acknowledge. That civilization is a thin veneer over systems of control that have changed less than we think. That the apparatus kings built to dominate their subjects' sexuality hasn't been dismantled, just refined and hidden. That we still live in a world where your body is subject to state authority, where sexual transgression is punished differently based on your wealth and power, where the machinery of humiliation and control continues to function, even as we tell ourselves we've evolved beyond such barbarism. If this makes you uncomfortable, if you're thinking about how sexual punishment still operates in ways we don't want to examine, then you're starting to see what historians of these medieval tortures understood. That studying the past isn't about cataloguing cruelty for shock value. It's about recognizing patterns that persist, systems that adapt but never quite disappear, power structures that find new forms but serve the same functions. The kings who impaled adulteresses and burned witches, who built cages for fornicators and stakes for sodomites. They believed they were maintaining order, protecting society, enforcing God's will. And they had entire legal and philosophical systems justifying every torture they inflicted. We look back at them and see monsters. But what will people 500 years from now see when they look back at our systems of sexual control? What will they think of our mass incarceration, our sex offender registries that never expire, our public shaming rituals that have simply moved from town squares to social media? The tools change, the technology evolves, but the underlying desire to control sexuality through punishment, that remains constant across centuries. And until we acknowledge that, until we examine how we've inherited and perpetuated these systems, we're just continuing the work that those medieval kings started, telling ourselves we're different, while deploying the same mechanisms of control they pioneered. Some stories demand to be told, not because they're shocking, but because they reveal uncomfortable truths about the present. The history of royal sexual punishment is one of them. These weren't aberrations or excesses of a less enlightened age. They were systematic, bureaucratized, legally sanctioned efforts to control populations through control of sexuality. And that project never ended. It just learned to hide itself better.